to another fabulous episode of Tickle Life's podcast. And I'm super, super stoked about our conversation today. So for everybody who doesn't know who I am, I'm Gaia Morissette. I'm your hostess with the mostest. And I'm going to allow my fantastic new guest here, who I just met, which I'm super excited to learn more about her, as you guys get to learn more about her. So the floor is yours.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for having me join this podcast today and share my story and perspective. Every opportunity I really appreciate and embrace. So first of all, thanks. My name is Jenelle Marie Pierce. I'm the Executive Director of the STI Project and an adjunct professor and the spokesperson for PositiveSingles.com. I'm a sexual health educator and STI specialist. I'm an STI positive STI specialist. I'm living with genital herpes, and I've also had HPV and scabies.
Right on. So we're gonna talk. You're gonna lean into that. That's what we're gonna talk about today. We're gonna really go there. Before we do that,
yes,
I always like to ask my guests a fun wake up, easy question. Right. So, do you sleep in the nude or with pajamas?
Ooh, both. My husband would prefer I slept in the nude more often, but we sleep with 2 dogs and 2 cats, and so hair gets everywhere and in the bits and stuck to things. So typically I'll put undies on or whatever, but both. It just depends on what the heat is and what we did in advance of actually going to sleep.
Nice. And are you a panty wearer or are you a commando out in the world?
I'm a panty wearer. I have an innie vulva, and I feel like my vulva eats my pants all the time if I don't have some small lining. But I actually wish that I were a non-panty wearer for that, also for the same reason, because I'm constantly adjusting and messing with, no matter whether it's a thong or bikini or whatever style it is. They're not comfortable, but I've also very much tried to just not do undies. And then I find that the same happens with my pants. So I think it's just the shape of my specific vulva and how that works with our clothing style.
All right. Okay, so tell us what we're talking about today.
Well, talking about living with an STI and kind of all the things that come with it, STI stigma, how STIs are perceived in the general population, how that is incredibly harmful, and how so many people actually have an experience with an STI. The vast majority of people who are sexually active have an experience with an STI. I didn't know that when I first contracted herpes, so I was totally isolated, alone, and it was awful for a very long time for me. So that's kind of my why of why I got into the space of sexual health education, because I wanted the experience to not be so horrific for other people. I was hoping that basically creating a resource for folks that I desperately needed, because I was mired in the stigma. I really felt like everything that was associated with an STI, that you were slutty, trashy, damaged, dirty, promiscuous, all of these subjective, very harmful sex negative terms. I thought, well, that must mean that's what my situation is. That must be who I am and what I am. And at 16 years old, high school in general can be really harmful or tough, and a tough time of life anyways. And that's when I contracted herpes. So all of those things really poured in and impacted my life going forward for a long time thereafter.
So let's go into the story. Let's bring us into that story. How did it happen? How you found out? What, all of those pieces, so that you can take the audience on this journey of what it was like for you at 16 and what ended up happening for you.
Sure. It's actually been a little while since I've kind of told this story start to finish, or really from that baseline. So this is kind of fun, and it'll be interesting, and you're getting the authentic, 20 some years removed. I'm 38 now, or going on 38. Oh my goodness, I'm adding some age to myself, but hey, we're not going to be ageist, and that's all right. So why not embrace that? 38 is happening soon anyway. So anyhow, so I was 16. I had already been sexually active. A lot of people ask, do you know who you got it from? And, were you having sex, or was it a lot of people contract herpes from oral sex. And At that point in time, I was already what you would consider like traditional heteronormative sexually active, like penis and vagina activity. And I'd had a couple of partners. I was always super sexually explorative anyways. Like I was very much interested through my adolescence into teenage years. Just my sexuality was very front and foremost in my psyche. Like it really did. It was something I was very interested in exploring. And I was having this juxtaposition. I grew up in a rural city outside of a very big city. Grand Rapids, Michigan is the second largest city in Michigan.
Mhm.
And I grew up in a small town outside of Grand Rapids, and country, like we used to call it's called Caledonia, but we used to call it Cowadonia because there were more cows than there were people. Now it's starting to get built up a little bit, but that really is the environment. There was like one Black person in school. And so very non-diverse, very Christian, conservative. And I was going to youth group at the time and all of that. And I had this dichotomy of I want to explore my sexuality, but I also want to save myself for marriage because I thought that that's what people needed to do. And that was the way in which to be a good girl and to be something and desirable. And all of, I had these horrible constructs and mindset about virginity anyways. And all of those harmful things that you hear very often were very present in my life. But I started exploring with like manual sex and oral sex, thinking like, well, I'll just save like penis and vagina sex until marriage, which is all sex is sex, of
Yes.
course. But
Yes.
at this time, that was that mindset. Like maybe this is what I'm going to do. So by the time I did contract herpes, though, I had already navigated into and finally gotten to the point where I was having like all different kinds of sexual activity and enjoying all different kinds of sexual activity. And I'd had a couple of partners. And so specifically to the herpes story is I had and experienced what would be what a lot of people assume is a traditional outbreak. And so I had small, tiny blisters on my vulva, and they weren't going away, and they were getting a little bit worse and kind of spreading. And the first outbreak is always the worst typically because your body hasn't developed antibodies and things. And
Okay, hold
so
on. I want to ask
it
some
wouldn't
questions.
go away.
Hold on.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Ask a couple questions.
Sure.
So when this started to appear, did you know anything? Did you know what it was? Did you know it was happening? Were you freaking out? Like what was happening internally within your
So I
thought
was
process?
freaking out, super uncomfortable. I didn't know for sure. Like I knew of STIs, but I really didn't ever expect that was something that I would have to experience. Like in my head, I wasn't having sex with those kinds of people and I wasn't at risk. And this was only a risk that like certain kinds of people experience, trashy people or trailer park people, all these stereotypes. Of course, this is so bad and harmful, but this is exactly what I was thinking at that 16 years old. And so I knew of it and was petrified and thought, well, maybe it's like a yeast infection or maybe it's just something else. And I was just hoping and praying and like really hoping it wasn't, but it wouldn't go away. So finally I told my mom and she looked at it. She asked, do you want me to look at it? Like, what are, and I was like, yeah, because it was so miserable. It'd been going on for about a week and it was getting more painful, more uncomfortable and such. And so she looked at it and said, all right, we need to schedule you an appointment. And I didn't go to school that day. And actually, that's why I didn't go to school. It was the middle of summer. Now that I'm thinking about that, I've got to think about when that timing was. Yes, it was the middle of summer when I was 16. So I was like, why did I go during the middle of the day to the doctors? But that's exactly why. So she got me in right away that day. She didn't say at the time that it was herpes. She thought it was and was hoping also for my sake that it wasn't. So
Mm-hmm.
just basically she was like, we need to go in. And so we did. And so we went in to our general practitioner, our family doctor, right in Caledonia, Michigan. And, the same person who, fixes and sprints a broken leg or, diagnoses your flu and gives you a flu shot and, all the other family medicine kinds of things that happen. So I get on the table, take my clothes off, get on the table, and he looks at it, takes one look and says, okay, you can get dressed, and then walks out of the room. Doesn't say anything. So
And
I'm
how are you
sitting there
feeling?
for what? Well, it felt like 5,000 years is what it really
Mm-hmm.
felt like. And I think it was a significant amount of time because he cultured it. So we went and looked under a microscope and, it felt like 15, 20 minutes later. And so you're just petrified. Like, what are they going to say? You're also embarrassed because this guy had like was somebody I could never have identified with, especially at that age or even now. Like, he was physically looked different and awkward and had like one eye and a partial ear and was bald and white and older, middle-aged, old to me at that point at 16 years old. And so just this person who, like, I felt like, oh my gosh, they don't know, and I don't know him, and they're looking at my privates and your genitals at that point in time is like so embarrassing. And yeah, I was mortified, and I felt gross. I felt dirty, like I was bad, or like even before he came back in. And then he comes back in and says, "You have herpes. It's the worst case I've ever seen. And here's a prescription for Valtrex." And that was it. That was all the information that I was given. No supporting, no resources, know how common it was, know that this is not such a big deal, know that the first outbreak is always the worst or very commonly the worst, and and the fact that even he said that this is the worst case I've ever seen. First of all, that's like superfluous and ridiculous on such a level, because if you Google herpes, you see like these worst cases of people who are immunocompromised in third world countries, and that's very rare. And usually a herpes outbreak is so super mild. And so to tell me that not only do I have an STI, this taboo infection that's regarded as horrible and gross and sick and all of these things, now I have the worst version of it. So I'm not only just a slut, a whore, trashy, damaged, I'm the dirtiest, the sluttiest, the whoriest, the most damaged possible. I mean, all of these things were pouring through me. So I'm bawling, and my mom gives me the car keys and says, "I'll pay the bill and you can go out and sit in the car." I don't remember this part of it. But she said I bawled the entire way home. I cried and cried and cried. And I just kept repeating over and over and over again, nobody's going to ever want me again. Who will ever want me? I'm never going to be able to have sex. I can't get married. What am I going to do? No one will want me. No one will want me. Like, this just was coming right out. And I actually don't remember that experience. It's funny because now I've told that story a couple of times. It almost feels like a memory, but when my mom initially told me, I didn't even remember having said that. And I knew I was devastated, mortified, absolutely full of shame, but I didn't realize that was my immediate, like, emotional, visceral response. So, and she just tried her darndest. I mean, bless her. My mom's been pretty open in, like when I first got my period, she showed me what a tampon does in a jar and like put water in it and then, put the tampon in and says, that's what it'll do in your body when it's soaking up blood and stuff. And so she's been really, both of my parents are pretty open in that kind of way, but it was still one of those things where it's like, even though my mom's saying, no, that's not true, you're going to be okay, I'm so sorry, I love you, you're beautiful, that this won't change anything. At 16, you don't think your parents know anything. You think they absolutely have no idea.
Yes.
So even though she said this, and she wanted me to believe it so badly. And then and I knew she would tell my dad. I mean, she didn't in front of me or anything like that, but my mom and dad are still together and they're close. And I'm close with them. And so she did, I knew he knew, but I was just so embarrassed. I was just so absolutely like, shame is the only thing I can think of. I don't know if you've seen Game of Thrones, but when Cersei gets shamed and walks down, there's a scene where they shave her head and she's only in this like sheath of clothing, and she was a queen, and now they're making her walk down the middle of the city and everybody's yelling shame, 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 and like ringing bells at her. And I mean, it's profound because I saw that scene and it like brought that all the way back again. Like I really could empathize and resonated with this character on the screen, because I'm like, oh my gosh, that's exactly how I felt. That's exactly how so many people feel. Like, man, it was horrible. It was, for me, that experience was one of the worst experiences in my life.
So what ends up happening? So how long do you stay in that space? What happens next for you?
Yeah, so that's interesting because I stayed in the space for so long, but it was a slow process over time to where, I mean, I couldn't even say I have herpes. I couldn't even utter it without totally losing emotional composure. And initially I told one of my best friends. She ended up telling a whole bunch of other people. I found out later that not only did she tell like other girls, but she told, there would be guys who would approach her and say like, hey, your friend's hot, like, can I get her number and whatever. And she said, oh no, you don't want to date her. She's going to infect you. She's just going to give you herpes. So she would say this to everyone, obviously not a friend, and I'm not friends with her anymore. And, but at the time I felt like I deserved that treatment. I knew that she was telling some people, but I also felt like, of course she would, because I'm this bad person. And so
Mhm.
she's warning everybody about me, I mean, just horrible psychologically. And so I didn't really, so it kind of damaged a lot of friendships, in my trust in females, and my trust in just even sharing that information. So it was really hard for me to disclose. And the first partner I disclosed to, I didn't disclose until after I'd already put them at risk. Like we had sex, and then I like pulled them to the side and said, I need to talk to you about this. I'm so sorry. Like, this is horrible. I cried, and I felt horrible. Like I didn't want to harm someone or put them in a place where they were not having informed consent and able to consent to it. But I just had no idea how to bridge this conversation and how to go about it. But then, my mental like awareness of this is not who I want to be, and I don't want to be this person who's harming people comes back. And that's when I end up disclosing. And actually, interestingly enough, that person didn't care and was like, well, this doesn't change who you are, and that's no big deal. And they were really amazing. So I ended up dating that person for a while, and subsequent disclosures were similar. It even took me a long time to be able to disclose ethically and before putting people at risk, which again is part of my why of why I do the work I do, is because I know that this happens to other people too. And I knew I couldn't be the only one who doesn't know how to have these conversations, who's absolutely petrified of what that might mean. And to circle back, actually, to answer another question that some people, I didn't actually specify, but everybody always asks. And not everybody always needs to share this. People always ask, like, do you know who you got it from? And part of that is because we have this tendency to want to point fingers and
Mhm.
blame, in terms of the outcomes and the things that happen as a result of the choices that we make, and all the risks that we engage in our life. But that said, for me, I didn't know. And because I had said I'd already had a couple of partners at that point in time, and this speaks to the reason why I brought this up, is because I was once I found out I had herpes, I was too scared of, if I asked, because I'd had a couple of partners, if I asked the wrong person and they didn't have it, and it was the other person, then now more people would know. And now this person might share it, because if I didn't tell the person, if I didn't pick the right one to ask, and
Mhm.
now I know they might not have even known. So that was kind of that mindset around how horrible it would be if somebody found out, if more people found out what my social status would be, like how that would impact relationships and people's perception of me. And all of that was like impacted, whether or not I could have communicate about that in a healthy way, all of those things. So yeah, but so then to, again, the long story short, to answer your question in a succinct way, it took me until I was in my late 20s to really come full circle and feel like, wait a minute, this doesn't add up about what people say, what the stigma is associated with STIs, and how I feel about myself and who I am.
Mhm.
But it took many, many relationships, many, many successful and happy, or not successful, but just positive experiences disclosing. And it took me learning who I was and having my own like professional and personal and relationship successes to realize that, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with my character and all of that. But it was a giant, long, long, long process for me.
Mhm. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Like sharing the vulnerabilities and sharing the struggles with that journey for you, because so many people go through that and they do feel alone and they do feel isolated. And the shame, like that, you were talking about that, the walk of shame, that just this deep deep shame of your existence. It's something that which is, at the end of the day, is absolutely ridiculous and doesn't need to exist, and it doesn't need to be there. And the doctor was a jerk face, and like all of those pieces, and your friend was not very supportive, and like without all of those pieces didn't need to exist. And I love that, the fact that you're showing up in the world to help the world change that.
Yeah, I mean, even when you think of the doctor, like of all the people you think might be empathetic to a medical experience like that, some sort of, infection condition, whatever, you would assume that it would be a medical practitioner. So that also played into how much I was mired and spiraled along these lines, because I thought, well, if a doctor says this is the worst, and if a doctor is kind of like grossed out and perpetuating their own internalized stigma, which is what he was doing. But
Hmm.
I just felt like, well, if they feel this way, if they're kind of like, get out the door. And, they essentially, he shamed me without providing resources or any sort of support whatsoever, even from a medical practical standpoint. I thought, well, then everybody is going to feel this way,
Mm-hmm.
and even the friend experience, that wasn't an individual experience either. There was another friend who I had shared and opened up to her a few years later, and we went to Canada. Michigan borders Canada. In Canada, you can drink earlier, so people in Michigan always cross the border and go to like party when you're not 21. And so we
Yes,
did. We
I'm
went with a
I'm
couple of
Canadian. We're
girls.
we're we're in Canada.
Yay! We love you. I know we're annoying to you, I'm sure, all the people who come and do that, but I don't even know if it's beneficial to the economy, to be honest. It's probably just super obnoxious, but in hindsight,
So
at
yeah, so
20
you
or
came
19, you
over.
don't care.
Yeah, you came over because our drinking age is 19 versus 21. Yep. Okay.
So we came over, and the girlfriend who I told prior to this experience had brought a couple of her friends. And so there was like 5 of us in a hotel room, and we were all just going to share the beds. And I ended up meeting this super hot Australian guy while we were out at the bars, and we make out, and him and his friends come back to the hotel room and hang out in the hall. And the girls didn't want him to come into the hotel room because they didn't want it to escalate and it to get even um, more intimate than that, I suppose. But anyway, so I stood out in the hall with him and made out for a long time. And then some of the other guys had wandered off. And then it was just the girls back in the hotel room. And when I got back into the hotel room, they had laid out a sleeping bag on the floor and said, this is where your bed is. And I thought at the time they were jealous because I had this super cute Australian guy and I was making out with him and like whatever. I thought it was jealousy that way, or they were mad because I didn't immediately come back and I did stay in the hallway and make out with this guy. I don't know. I just figured like they were just unhappy that that's what I was doing. And turns out a couple of years later, the same friend who I went to Canada with, she calls me up and she says, Jenelle, I have something I need to tell you and I really need your help. And she said, you're the only person I can tell. And I said, okay, let me know, like, go for it, whatever. And she says, but I have to tell you something first. And I said, okay. And you have 2 things to tell me, so go with it, A or B, whatever. So she says, well, remember when we went to Canada and you remember how the girls were so mean to you? And I said, yeah. And she said, it's because I told them you had herpes. And so they thought that if you slept in the same bed with them, that if we shared a bed, that they would contract your herpes. So that's why they made you sleep on the floor. So, and she says, the reason I'm telling you that is because I have genital warts and I just contracted it and got diagnosed. And so not only is she telling me that she did this horrible thing to me, then she wants my support and empathy and love and like somebody to give her a shoulder to cry on. And at the time I did still, because I was still again in my younger 20s, and I tolerated a lot of cruelty. I tolerated
Mm.
a lot of bullying, and I tolerated a lot of female on female. Um, and I only say that because normally I talk about like people with vulvas, but when we're talking about female identifying
Yeah.
versus female identifying, there's a lot of like cruelty and girls being really mean to other girls. And in terms of our it's part of the patriarchy in our society
Yeah.
structure, of course, blah, blah, blah. But that said, I tolerated more of that than I should have and didn't have boundaries and allowed that. And so I did. And so I was really nice to her. And then she did some other things. I'm not friends with her either. She did some other things later on. And I finally realized like I need to stop allowing people to abuse me, essentially, to use me and abuse me. And I don't deserve that. No one does. Just because I have herpes doesn't mean I deserve this kind of treatment.
That's beautiful. Congratulations. We can spend
It is.
a lifetime. We can spend a lifetime in that place of being on the receiving end of that abuse, especially if the shame we believe to be true. And so it's like you believe that that's what you deserve and all those places. So it is a congratulations. It is a woo woo, because, people can spend a whole lifetime and not be able to come to that place. So congratulations.
Yeah. Exactly. It's so true. It took me such a long while, and it's like I see that happening for other people, and it's not easy to do. It's not easy to
No.
get to that place, because then you have to start saying no, and people don't like no's, and people don't like boundaries, and they don't always want to respect your space and your autonomy. And so, yeah, it's not easy to do, but when you get to that point, and it's still like it's a journey. It's not a destination. Like, it's ongoing. I'm still always working on it and always will be, and I always hope to. But when you get to that point where you're finally able to start actually saying, no, I don't deserve this, and you're not going to treat me that way, man, is it so empowering. It is just like, it's so incredibly, it's like freeing, and it is so healing and cathartic. It's just absolutely wonderful. And what's so cool is I'm able to share that, not even necessarily from a professional standpoint, but because I've had that lived experience, and I'm able to, and if it were not even for me sharing it and consulting with thousands of other people, even that own personal lived experience, I'm able to share and empower people within my circles, like my friends and family members. And I'm able to help and be a person who understands what they're walking through, and to help encourage them when they're ready and when they're to that place to start saying no for the first time, to start cutting out toxic or harmful relationships or relationship dynamics, or the people, not people aren't necessarily toxic, but people who are being toxic toward them. And it's just wonderful. It's wonderful to be able to help and support people through that, because man, it was such like years. Even my
Mhm.
parents were like, Jenelle, you just keep letting these people back in, and they're so bad, and they don't care about you, and they're just so jealous, or whatever it is, and a lot of it was jealousy, for obviously not because I had herpes, but for other reasons. And jealousy, I think, of all the emotions, is probably one of the most harmful. Anger is not even harmful in this kind of context. Jealousy makes people turn into really, really horrible individuals and do some cruel, cruel stuff, really
That
bad behavior. So
Yes, that is very true. So, how can we, before we switch over into how people can spend more time with you, what's going on in your world professionally, is there anything, what was the one thing that you wish you knew? All the things that you know now, if you could have known when you were 16, that would have been a game changer. What would that be, one thing be?
one is tough, but just off the top of my head, I would say it's understanding or knowing that almost every single person encounters and contracts an STI. Every single sexually active person, more than 90%. So that to me, even though I wouldn't have thought I knew anybody, just knowing that you do, nobody's talking about it, and nobody feels that they can talk about it. And so that's why it's so isolating, and you feel so alone, and you feel like you're the only one and you're this bad person. But knowing that everybody, people I love, respect, and admire, and my friends, family members, so many people, like once I started doing this work, everybody came out of the woodwork, like messages poured in. It was profound. And I'm like, if everybody knew, and these are people who know each other and who also felt alone. And I'm like, if you knew that, and of course I have to hold that in confidentiality. So I can't tell them that somebody that they know, that basically everyone they know also has the same STI or has had an STI. Like, it's just, man, it's so heartbreaking, because it's like, if people really realize that it's basically the vast majority, it
Hmm.
would be like a cavity, we're contracting the flu, and that's how we should look at it. So like, oh man, if I would have known that, I think it would have helped to know that it has nothing to do with character, specific behavior necessarily. It is just a fact of sharing your body intimately. Our bodies are wonderful, but they're not infallible.
Hmm. Beautiful. So, how can people spend more time with you?
Yes, absolutely. So the website that I'm the executive director for is the stiproject.com. And I'm also all over social media and basically all platforms that you engage in social media. So find me at the STI Project. And then I just launched a new program, actually, that for the month of June is free for all folks in the Black community. But right now we're in the pre-sale for everyone else, and it's 56% discounted. We're going to do an 8-week course of deep diving into stigma and overcoming shame and walking through that shame and fear and the stigma of an STI diagnosis. But anyone who's in the Black community can get that for free. Just reach out to me. Let me know you'd like to participate, and yeah, and then you'll get signed up. Would love to have you. But anyways, come and see me online.
Mm-hmm. And so can you give the shout out? We'll put it in the show notes too, but give a shout out again. What's the website? What's the...
Oh, for sure. Yes. So the STIproject.com. And then on social media, I'm at the STI Project.
Beautiful. And why did you, and what do you do? What's your kind of thing? What would you say is like, all right, these are the things that I do in the world?
I'm an educator primarily. I'm an educator at the individual as well as community level and collegiate as well. So I kind of do all different facets, whether it's one-on-one public speaking and events, as well as guest speaking and teaching actual college courses. And yeah, so educator, I think, would be my primary role of what I would identify as.
And why, what turns you on about that? What gets you excited? What's your why?
I think education is empowering and is empowerment and really elevates our ability to advocate for ourselves. The more we know, like had I known all of the information that I know about STIs now, I wouldn't have felt the way I do. And so I feel very truly like, of course, the human level and that connection is super important. But because I'm an analytical, logical, kind of realistic mind is what primarily drives me. I really love all of that information because I think that that helps us to move forward if we really truly are informed.
It was so nice having you on the show. You're quite lovely. Thank you so much for
It was my pleasure.
Like leaning in and this is not an easy conversation to have, and so thank you. Thank you for me, and thank you for the audience. So
it's my absolute pleasure.
I have a feeling though we should, there's some other things that, you maybe should want to come back on to the show for. We can have a conversation about some other things that you might want to share about your journey and your adventures so the audience can get to know some other aspects of you. I think that would be great.
Oh, for sure. I would love to. Anytime, especially if folks have additional questions and would like follow up, I'd be happy to. If y'all want to reach out to me and let me know, and then we could do like a short question and answer, as well as following up and supporting whatever is necessary in your audience and what your audience feels is helpful.
That'd be awesome. That'd be awesome. So I'll talk to I'll talk to staff at the Tickle.life, and maybe we can set up even like a question and answer live. Like we could do some fun stuff. So let's go talk to the team, see what they can come up with, the tech people, and and so stay tuned to see what ends up happening. Thanks for being on the show. Don't forget to check out Tickle.life's podcast. It can be found on all of the social media platforms, all the podcasting platforms. If you want to spend more time with me and get to know me more, you can visit me at succulentliving.com, as well as you can check out my podcast, which is called My Orgasmic Life, where we dive into all sorts of juicy things. So have a beautiful day. May it be filled with juiciness, hopefully some happy bum wiggling, and we'll see you you can listen to us on our next show. Bye-bye.